Ladies and gentlemen, guys and girls, welcome to this episode of the Anchors Maximus podcast. I am Satorian Anchors Maximus. Alongside me is the Gate Aidan Colyer, and we are back, folks. After we took a week off last week, we're back, and we got a fun topic, interesting too, controversial perhaps, and we're going to be talking about why is Western history so glorified in society over Far Eastern history? Basically, why is it that we know more about the Western history, like France, Europe, and the United States, and the Americas, and when it comes to Asia and India and countries east of the Caucasus Mountains, we don't know too much about them. So as always, before we get into the topic, Aidan, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. As always, the weather report, it is lovely weather today. Nice blue skies and fluffy clouds as well. And if you see flashes of white from over here, that's the... Where's my finger going? There. That's the guinea pig being a small fluffy white cloud as well. But yeah, in general, yeah, I'm good. I'm happy. I've got my beer, so as ever.
Mm-hmm. And I'm doing pretty well myself. I'm busy with, I'm going to be doing a special editions for my upcoming book. So, I'm excited to do that. And working on my next book, Winnie. So, pretty much normal for me as well. So, anyway, not that we know we're having good days, it's time to get into the topic at hand. So Aidan, I've been thinking about this question the entire week. Why is it that we care about more about, or we know more about Western history than Eastern history? And I have a couple of theories. I was talking to Lee Edwards, who unfortunately I don't think he's going to be able to show up today. And he says it's because it's something about the vision. They want us to know more about Western history over Eastern history to keep us divided. And I told him that's a pretty strong theory, but I think it definitely does go deeper than just that. There's definitely a lot more that meets the eye than just that.
I found it really interesting that he said that. So when I was thinking through it, I thought about the history that we know as people.
Mm-hmm.
What gets us started? Obviously, we're people now as adults. We read around history. We can go find whatever history we want. We've got the internet. We can read about whatever part we want. So we've got that exposure. We can do those things. However, when you look at education, is really where you start learning about history.
Right.
By necessity, in your country, you will have the history education over here is weird. I think the US does it slightly better in that you've got US history and a more international, like world history thing. And you kind of split it up in your curriculum, whereas we don't do that. We just have a curriculum of history, so we'll learn about things. For us in the UK, that then necessarily means we're learning about our history. We've got so much of it as well. We've got to cover those important points, and then we've got to cover going outwards. You start studying further and wider. So, for example, if you take my history education, standard syllabus. I started school just around the time that they introduced what's called national curriculum. So every school in the UK, there are some bits where they can move things around a little bit, but you have to teach about certain things at certain times, at certain key stages. So if someone is in, like my son's in year 7, I knew that he'd be learning about the Normans because everyone in year 7 learns about the Normans. We do that because that is where we start the foundation of our country as well. So you have that foundation of your country taught about in history, and we talk about foundation myths as well. So if you learn about the Saxons over here as well, you've got the myth of Hengist and Horsa coming over. It is a complete myth. It's the Saxons came over and then they killed all of the local populace and moved them around and got rid of them all, and then that's where the Saxons come from, and we're descended from them, but our country itself comes from the Normans. That's a foundation myth. It's wrong. That first part, definite myth. As soon as you get to 1066 with the Normans, there's no mythology there. It's just straight history. That's about our history. Now, if you go to the US, for example, when we're teaching about the Normans, that's not really appropriate to teach as a lesson about that thing in the US. You're going to learn about the revolution, the early
Right.
days of the West, the early colonial past.
Yeah. Lewis and Clark and all that. Hmm.
Yeah. And then if you go to somewhere such as, say, if you're in, so my education's weird because I spent a lot of my primary school in Northern Ireland. So there's a slight tweak in there as well. While it was Northern Ireland, it's British curriculum, but there is a certain amount of Irish history that goes into there as well, which links with, say, geography as well.
Hmm.
So you, one of the things that you do learn about primary school over here is you learn about highwaymen and the 1700s and basically things that were going on, but it's always about highwaymen. So
Hmm.
in British schools, say in England, not sure about Scotland, how they do it. They've probably got their own one, but
Yeah.
they probably also focus on Dick Turpin. He's the big one, and there's a lot of myths. All of the famous highwaymen, all of the myths are ascribed to every single one of them at the same time. That it's they all did very similar things. But I learned about a guy called Nisha Harkin as well, who's the highwayman, which was very funny when I got to Norfolk and they did the was everyone learnt about who's the famous highwayman. They all said Dick Turpin, and I come out with my best Northern Irish Nisha Harkin, and everyone just looked at me. I'm like, what? Who's this Dick Turpin character?
Right.
And that's in one country that you get that slight division, that you get that more localized
Hmm.
history coming in there, so that even at that level you've got differences, but it's important. You're learning the topic you're learning about is highwaymen, and about everything that we learn about them, same, absolutely the same, but the person who was the focus is different depending on the country,
Yes.
and that's just within a
Hmm.
very standardized curriculum as well. It goes to the US. You don't really have highwaymen in the US. Well, you did early on. That's a weird
Yeah.
topic, but
Well, and
what
Aiden.
you get is you get into the cowboys and all
Yeah.
the stuff that the cowboys
Oh,
passed.
another thing, Aiden, and I'm sure there's a big difference between England and Wales. I'm sure as
Yes,
well.
yeah.
Yeah, the Welsh.
Mm,
So I'm sure you get a different education in Wales as well,
yeah.
and when it comes to history.
I've got a few friends who, a few Welsh friends,
Hmm.
and their education is ever so slightly different. The national curriculum is different in each part of the United Kingdom. That
Yeah,
there are certain changes, hence
that's
why
what
you
I
get the Nisha Hawking Dick Turpin
that's
thing.
what I
But
find
yeah,
that's what I find so fascinating. And it makes sense here in the United States because in the North, like New York and all that, they teach you about like people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. Now, if you go to the South, they actually avoid those people. You see, right, even right there. So it's a
it's
big difference,
and it's the difficult topic thing is
right?
we tend to reserve
Hmm.
our difficult topics until you get to about year 9 and then GCSE, which is years 10 and 11. So that age wise, just to give this a thing for comparison, our year 7 is obviously it's quite clear. It's the 7th year of education. We do have a year 0 as well, which is weird. But
Oh,
the
okay.
7th year of education is you are 11 to 12.
Hmm.
Um, uh, so and then it's 12 to 13 for year 8. 13 to 14 is year 9. And when you're doing GCSEs, that's when you're about 15. And that's when, when you hit 16, when you're doing your GCSEs, obviously that's considered in a lot of Western countries. We have a whole thing in Western countries that 16 is a clear cut off where you'll start to become a proper adult. You're recognized. I know in South American and a lot of Latin American cultures, obviously being 16 is a big thing. Obviously, they
Yeah.
make programs about it as well. And
Yes.
that's the first stage. And we consider that in our curriculum. We start talking about those darker topics. So that's when you start learning about the Holocaust over here,
Hmm.
because we do teach about it sort of in a roundabout way earlier on. But to learn about it, you need to learn all of the horrific stuff that went on to understand it properly. Until you're 16, you can't learn about that, which obviously has an impact. Yeah,
Hmm.
now have a think about all of those things that I've said. That is all very, very Western history. It's very
Yes.
important Western history, but it's Western history. Now, if we were in China, for example, and we were learning about, you've got to learn about this big atrocity, we possibly wouldn't be learning about the Holocaust in that detail. That might be the age where
Correct.
you'd learn about the rape of Nanking, about the invasion of Manchuria, those early days of the Chinese the revolutions in the 30s. leading up into the Second World War and all of the fighting.
Right.
It's a separate conflict for a lot of the time as well. Just kind of happened and was integrated into the Second World War.
And I believe I have friends who were from Tibet. Back in New York, we had neighbors who were from Tibet, and they would tell me that in parts of China, they would not even teach you the history of Tibet, because China claims that they're the owners of Tibet. Although we all know that's kind of BS, but I'm not going to get into that right now.
Yeah, it's the recognition of Tibet, which is another thing as well that you've got that influence, the political influence on it. That even if you try and keep that out of your education, it's always going to be in there to a certain extent. So, for example, one of the topics that is rarely brought up in our system, we do very little modern history.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Aidan. We have Dungeon Dan Ubell. Thank you for joining us, Dungeon Dan.
Dungeon Dan.
He says, here in Texas, we pretty much ignore all of you. That sounds about right, Dungeon Dan. Yeah, you're not wrong about that. Yeah, pretty much. But I think another thing is, Aidan, they say history could be biased, because history, we tend to focus on the winners over the losers. We always glorify the ones who won the battles. We can go as far as the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is probably the most talked about empire because they were always victorious. Why do you think we don't talk about the Carthaginians, the Etruscans, the Iberians, the Celts, the Gauls? Because they didn't beat the Romans, because the Romans beat them.
And then you think, when the Western Empire falls, how many of us actually learned about Italy in the post-fall? I know about that because that was stuff that I looked at university. But even then, that's post-education. That's post. That's on your own. You're paying for that for yourself. You're doing on your own will. Yeah, you're going. You're seeking it as such. Yeah.
Because I took up when I went to high school, we got global history in freshman year, global history, right? And they talk about the Roman Empire, and then they skipped the early Byzantine Empire, or in the UK Byzantines, but you know what I'm saying. They skipped most of the quote unquote dark ages. I put them in quotes. They don't really talk about the early Byzantine Empire. And really, they don't talk about the Byzantine Empire too much. Even when I went to, I took up global history. I learned that on my own because I played Age of Empires.
Yes, exactly.
Like I said, it's a great resource. I mean, you might not think so, but those games are pretty good resources for history if you really want to brush up on history. I know you don't catch up with Age of Empires much, but they added the Georgian Empire and the Armenians.
Oh wow!
Yeah, that's DLC. Cool. I mean, you have to buy them, but at about $10, I think I'm going to invest in it. You can learn more about the Georgians I think they even got campaigns. So
the Georgians are really interesting.
Right there and then it's like, so I got to be honest with you. It's like it's a Age of Empires is how I learned out of my history. I didn't learn too much from school. I got to confess. And the other game we might have to play, Cossacks. I know more about the Napoleonic era. And
one of the other things about that is you then get the bias in games as well. I remember growing up when you got a computer game about World War II. If it was made by the Americans, the American units would beat everyone. If you got a game made by the Russians units would beat everyone.
I'm looking at you.
Units were always crap.
I'm looking at you, Sid Meier. I'm looking at Civilization, Sid Meier. Yeah. Although Sid Meier was Canadian, but Canadians and Americans getting on pretty well, so he's got that American bias. Oh, not to mention, when Sid Meier moved from Canada, he opened his company in America, so it's going to be American bias.
What are the other interesting things?
I don't know if you ever played this game. This is another good one, Rise of Nations.
I do. I own that disc as well somewhere as well.
Although Cossacks, there was actually a little bit of bias in Cossacks. Like the Ukrainian Seredik, they're like the most OP gunpowder unit, and the horses are overpowered. So yeah, it's a Ukrainian developer. So yeah, there's
Yeah.
but surprisingly, the Russian units are not weak because you figure that the Ukrainian developer would do that to Russia, trying to make them weak.
Mm.
But no, they didn't. They actually gave their due with the Sternets and the Don Cossacks.
I like playing the Russians in that because they've got a different way of playing because of the way the population comes from their houses. They've got that lovely bit of history in there with
Yeah.
their military system, which the Russian military system of that time period I know a decent amount about. And it's a really interesting where they're always playing catch up with Europe, the rest of
Hmm.
Europe. It was Peter the Great. He modelled his army on the Prussians. That was one of his big reforms.
Hmm.
Once he'd done that, which is why
Russian
corsets
Empire.
worn by men and high heels worn by men became very big
Yeah,
things in Russia.
we gotta do
There
an
were lots of
episode about that.
jokes in Europe about Russian officers wearing corsets
Hmm.
to make their waist thin. It was one of those weird quirks of the time. But but this is the thing is like when you branch out from we've learned about this and move outwards. So for example, our schooling, so we learn about Normans. So that's the early history of our country. If that goes up, we expand. In primary
Hmm.
school, I learned about obviously the Mesolithic, Neolithic, Paleolithic. We learn about prehistory as well. My one of the primary schools I went to, the headmaster was an archaeologist, hence why our education on that was actually pretty good, and potentially an influence later life, obviously. But when you move on through that education, we do expand out, and we go from Britain and we look to sort of Europe and the US to a certain amount as well. We're starting to have more lessons about the civil rights movement when we're doing modern history, because the US civil rights movement is a really good way of looking at that. Because over here we didn't really have something like that. As I've said many times, it's always been law that we've had these things. We never really went the US way with a lot of it, but we still had the societal issues, and it was just a lot of people going, well, no, this is the law, you can't do that. So we never really had to have massive protests
Hmm.
about it. So to teach about that, obviously, we've got to go to the US and go, look, this is what was happening in the US. This explains what this is. And because we see a lot of US media, it then gives us the context of what that is. So we learn about US history by dint of the US media in current day being so pervasive in the Western sphere, which makes we get to a very interesting point, especially about what Lee said about the division between can't see the East as good, and in the East you can't see the West as good. There's one thing. I don't. Do you know Chet? Chet Sandberg. Sandberg. He's an editor, little RPG guy. I don't know if you've come across him.
Yes, yes, I
Chet,
know who
yeah.
you're talking about. He's
So
the editor.
yeah, he posts up a lot of stuff about communism and sort of Buddhism and things like that. Some really intriguing questions. And he posted something up, and I found it very interesting as well. It was about individualism and collectivism. And obviously, in China, obviously you have they were communist for many years as well. So that ethos of collectivism, and in the West, is seen as individualistic. And I had to push back on some of the points. Like, I agree with certain parts of it, but it's not as black and white as the post made, which
Yeah,
is always
right.
is if you've got a meme format thing. And obviously the conversation we both agreed like it's and we've got different viewpoints on it. However, you've got that mindset behind what you're looking at as well. And so there's two things from this. There's first of all, there's how history education is developed. So first of all, you have the great man theory, which was the early way of doing it. You're looking at it's the kings, the popes, the sultans, the generals. They're the people that are the movement shakers. History happened because they did. So that would be, for example, learning about the Normans and going, well, Britain is like it is with the Normans because William the Conqueror. And then if we look at, oh, well, we end up having, like in the Hundreds War, and then it leads to the Crusades, the Pope. And then if you look at why the Islamic forces are coming in, well, then you look at Saladin as an important person. You look at like Catherine the Great in Russia with the expansion in
Yeah.
the 1600s. So you're looking at all these famous people. There was then a movement later on, especially around the 60s. It's the advent of communism becoming a thing and people's ideas changing, looking at the people being the movers and shakers. They went too far the other way. So we were looking at it was the people that did this. And so these group, you wouldn't have had this big person at the top if you didn't have all these people behind them. We then moved into, when I was at university, it was the era of, it was coming out of that and going, well, no, these great people, because of the way that society was back then, it's the big people at the top that were able to do these things. However, we have to acknowledge that they couldn't have done these things if they didn't have the other people. So that's become more integrated in its historiography, is how you study history and how you look at it and the emphasis. So you get this difference between sort of the collective, the people, and the people at the top, which is a very more individualistic way of looking at it. And when you then look at our education systems, the way that our education systems are now are based on what was happening in the Cold War. And now the US is a great example of this with the McCarthy era of there was no way in hell that you were saying anything good about communism, Russia, China,
Right.
anything in the Far East, the East Bloc. Right? No, they were all bad. US, very, very good. Europe, they're all right because they're our allies. But that's about it because they've got some weird sort of ideas over there.
But there was a 9-machine Germany.
Education. Yeah, and then you've got your split. So you've got this hard split line down the middle of this is East, this is West. Obviously, in the East, they have the same thing. Oh, those capitalists over there doing those things with their individualism. We work together to do these things. They trample on people to get this thing at the top. These are all ideas that we think about these days. You think the Wall Street movements as well. They come with these ideas which are very linked to those. We have a lot of societal problems for going too far one way or too far the other way on a lot of these issues. There is a lot to be said about the middle ground between those issues. Like I said, with historiography, we went too far from the great man theory to the everyone theory and now we're sort of going, well, actually, there's a bit of both in this, which leads to a greater understanding of history. So you get books about your average peasant farmer, which are really interesting. But you'll also, at the same time, get a book about Richard the Lionheart going on his crusades and what he did. And then you read both of them and put them together to get this history. But because we've got these two aspects, that then doubles the amount of history. Because there's so much history, especially in Europe, there's so much history of your country. By necessity, you're focusing on that. And then you get into GCSE, which is where it's an elective to be able to do history or not. You're then focusing on World War II because you have to. Like, it shaped the entire continent. The end of World War One through World War II and then the aftermath of World War II. That was all then set up during the Cold War, which is the aftermath of World War II, where it's East bad, West good. Until the Cold War ends, and we're in now the post-Cold War era, and with the internet and the opening up of countries where we can start learning about all of those things. However, because we've got all of this history, how the hell do we integrate that in our school systems? History education has so little time given to it. You can't cut anything out of that. It's like if you're learning about British history, which you should be in a British school, you can't really cut the Normans out to learn about the Ming Dynasty of China. Because, that's all very interesting. It's a nice part of history. Brilliant. Just as fascinating. But completely irrelevant. And it's that relevance to the people you're teaching about history that becomes the thing. And one of the things that I've always done is try and look at parallels between certain bits. And I tend to do that through time periods as well. Like I did in one of my essays, very historiography-based essay, linked to the formation of medieval villages after the Black Death. And I talked about the Cold War, which they were like, why are you talking about that? And do it with ancient Greece as well, with their wars. I remember doing that in my first year, the Peloponnesian War, bringing in like the Cold War, because people understand the Cold War. We of that generation, we lived through it. All the people marking that lived through more of it. We know about it. It's part of our life. It's in living memory, and getting those living memory bits. But then that necessitates, when you're writing for people in living memory, that you're talking about things focused on their country. And one of the things I had in my undergraduate dissertation was, and this is just within Europe, I was doing the Danubian Limes, which is the sort of the eastern end of the Danube. You're talking, your Romania, your Bulgaria, or the whole Balkans, everything. It's that area in general. I found it very difficult to actually get anything in English that was a decent study about that area. The translations were absolutely horrific translations, literally using like H's as F's because of how they translate. But it's the best that they could do. And a lot of the archives were in Sofia. Now, one of the things about that is that's the other side of the Iron Curtain. That's essentially the East as well. So when I was only at university, it was 20 years ago now, we hadn't integrated. We hadn't even integrated that East and West of Europe, let alone the East and West of the entire world coming in. And I think we're seeing it more as well, especially with the rise of manga in the West. And it has that knock-on effect of people looking at Japanese culture. Look at Japanese culture, you start looking at their history as well. And obviously they've got their very specific history and come in. But Total War also did this. The Japanese history is actually one of the few bits of history that is actually taught, not so much taught about, but actually have had prominence for a long time. It's because they were essentially a Western country in the East. So it was easy to integrate that. Obviously, hence why you get the whole manga thing, and it's Shogun Total War. There we are, Total War. That's it again, bringing us history that we weren't learning about before. And it's just one of those one of the only times that I found where I was learning about the history of the world as such, and it wasn't sort of hugely biased between one area and another area. It was when I was doing prehistory, because there aren't any countries at that point. It's just sort of grand areas, sort of like the Middle East has this. But even in that, we did talk about the Indus Valley civilizations, but our focus was more on the Levant region and the Fertile Crescent, and that is essentially it's the Middle East, but it's still considered sort of like Western as such. That's because it's the Middle East, it's the middle bit. But as soon as you get over into India, people know some things about Indian history as well. But then you get problems with sort of like India at the moment has the same problems that we've got in the West, where you've got some very right-wing people at the top blaming people for things. There's a lot of the far right in India blame everything on Churchill and the British Empire. It's like it's 100 years. It's what, it's 80 years, or was it 19? It's about 80 years since. 8 years would take us back to 1944. 1944 was when those ideas of independence came in, and when the empire was starting to not be a thing. It was the end of World War II, essentially, that started to become a thing. Obviously, it was later on. It was 48 that you actually had that proper independence and a proper transition period going on. So it's a long period of time, but they're still blaming that because that's what their grandparents taught. It's still in living memory for the people as well. And it's that out of Churchill bad, Hitler good. And I'm literally seeing the Indian people say Hitler should have won World War II. Like, if any of them had learned about the Holocaust, they would not be saying that. Right. But they don't learn about it because it's not a thing that happened over there. They've got their own atrocities to deal with.
And then I'll take it a step further, and then you got Gandhi. Don't forget about Gandhi. He went to England, and then he went to South Africa, and then he did some bad things in South Africa too. He wasn't a saint.
He was that type of person. However, if you go to India, he's basically a saint. And one of the things I find very interesting is I don't think we revere Churchill in our country. But the general attitude towards Churchill is he was the leader we needed in World War II to win the war. That's it. And apart from that, everyone's like, oh no, he was a massively horrendous, racist douchebag. He was a product of that Victorian era, we're better than you because we're white type of people. He was just a straight up white supremacist type. Hang on a minute, it's mine. What's happening to my internet? There we are, I'm back. He's a product of sorry, my connection's starting to go. It's all right. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to pause my camera, run to loop. When I come back, it should have sorted itself out as well, rather than it keep stopping. So give me 2 seconds, and you can carry on and talk about that specific bit of topic as well.
All right. All right, so when we now while we wait for Aiden to come back, I want to share my screen and show Gandhi. This is what Gandhi used to look like when he was younger, and yeah, as a young man. So definitely not the same guy that Gandhi. Definitely not. It's not definitely not the same guy that we know, or that well we always see in textbooks. This was definitely a different kind of Gandhi. Uh, and and obviously, I'm sure in India, or I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm sure in India they don't really talk about that aspect of Gandhi's life. They always try to promote. So another thing I wanted to bring up with Aiden is that the thing is the Western empires and the Eastern empires, the empires of the West and the East, never really came together until much later in life. So this is not a history we're missing. There goes Aiden. So I was talking about the idea that the empires of the West and the empires of the East never really got together too much later in history, because for the entire BC era, the Romans had no idea about the China. I mean, they knew about the Chinese, but they never really talked to the Chinese, or they would never text and exchange between the two empires. So in our Western explorers didn't know about China too much later, because you couldn't find artifacts or writings. So in other words, what happened in China mostly stood in China till much later in life. And by the time we made contact with China, China was a whole different empire compared to the Shang dynasty, all the other dynasties that came before. It was already a whole different China.
It's that interesting thing about the Silk Road being that connection between the two disparate parts that separate. So you think about it, Russia's essentially a no-go area from the 1300s right the way up for a good 150 years, even up to the 1600s, a lot of it as well. Because it was, as I mentioned earlier, Catherine the Great taking Siberia and then pushing the Russian Empire to what we imagine of Russia now. Russia was initially like up to the Ural Mountains and then not Siberia. It was that whole other land was basically unused land, as it were. It was tribal land. It wasn't nations. It was sort of like the US was before the colonies turned up. There were people and there were tribes and they were using the land, but they weren't formal nations compared to everywhere else, which means the history that you get of those areas as well is very you get a lot of oral history. There's not such a big, until you've got a big nation state, you don't really get this formal writing down of history of this, that, and the other. It's why we look at Greece and we look at Rome, and most of what we know about the Celtic areas is from the interactions between Greece and Rome with those areas.
Like India,
archaeological evidence.
Even India,
not a good example.
But what we know most about India is Alexander the Great marched all the way to the Indus River, and started to get into the northern and western parts of India before his men said, "We had enough. We want to go back home." But Alexander the Great was about the closest one that got to the Far East. That's about as close as the Western world got to the Far East back in the BC era. Obviously, that would change with Marco Polo, but that didn't come to much later in history.
And then the thing with this is, after that, you then end up with a resurgence, obviously, of various Persian empires going through. And if you're in the West, you can't get through the Persian Empire.
Right, the Parthians.
You can't get through Russia as well. You literally can't get over there. And then if you can't get over there as well. Yeah. So you're, and then in between, you've still got a lot of those areas as well, especially the stars. Like Afghanistan's a really, the reason that it's still got this strong tribal tradition is literally how the land is.
Right.
Britain became a country very quickly.
I talked to my father about Afghanistan. I like to call Afghanistan the Kenner of mighty empires. It's absolutely the killer of mighty empires, because you had the Indo-Greek kingdom that died off.
Yeah.
Even China tried to go into Afghanistan, and they failed.
Yeah, we did. It's the northwest
And
frontier.
look at the
It's
United
where
States.
Churchill fought as well, and then you get the Russians in the 80s, and
And
then
then the United States hates it.
And that's actually been one of the biggest things with US international policy, is that failure of Afghanistan, the knock-on effects about the US having its military in other countries. Now, if you think about after Afghanistan, realistically, since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was planned for so long as well, like you can't blame any single president. There was the way that it was handled at the time as very specific bits. Yeah, you can lay blame at some of the bits being done badly. However, when you look at it overall, it's like Obama had been trying to get out of there,
Right.
and then obviously Trump had his reasons for wanting to get out of there, so he's got a different political ethos, but still the same idea: we need to get out of here, type of thing. Biden comes along, like, yeah, still we need to just like not be there, type of thing. And obviously now China is making inroads into Afghanistan. The reason Afghanistan is so important in the modern age is northern Afghanistan actually has, apart from the poppy fields, so most of the world's opium is grown in Afghanistan. One of the things about the modern wars in Afghanistan is you end up getting, it's a thing that has happened in Africa a lot as well. The crops end up getting destroyed, and crops don't grow quickly, so you end up with starvation. So what you need to do is you need to have something fast growing that's expensive that you can sell to buy the food in. Once you start doing that, you don't want to go back because you're getting loads of money. And so this is where the term cash crop comes from. If you're growing cash crops, and it's opium poppies are grown there. And it's not just the illegal trade, it's the legal trade. It's all our morphine and everything comes from that. And then on top of that, you've got all the mines. If you've got a smartphone, bits of your smartphone came from Afghanistan. That's why China wants to go in there for mining rights.
To me, Aidan, Afghanistan is the key. It's the key that divides the Western world from the Eastern world. Afghanistan is the key.
Yeah, it's because, that central point between the two great blocks.
Because from Afghanistan, you can get to China, to the north and east. You could get to Pakistan, to the east, to the south and east is Pakistan, which eventually leads to India. And to the north, you can get to Russia, the Uzbekistan, all those little areas before Russia. And then if you go west is Iran.
Yeah. So you've got all of these you've got all these major or middling powers. I mean, the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all of those, the stans as we call them in the UK, that go sort of in a line to China from pretty much like it's almost the Black Sea across. That you've got these big countries, obviously heavily Russian influence. They were part of the Soviet Union, and now they're not. They do have massive issues there. This is the other thing about how much do you know about those countries? That is a very large chunk of the world as well. And I know some of it through fall of Soviet Union politics and the people that ended up in charge. Obviously, you ended up with a lot of questionable people in charge of things in the countries as well, but we don't know a huge amount about that. And you'd think we'd have learned more about that with how long were us and the US in Afghanistan? Because that was when I was in sixth form. It was the invasion. It was 2004. No, it was before that. It was 2003 that the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were around that time. And the withdrawal was, it's 20 odd years. It's basically 20 years. Yet we still, like, how much history do you know from Afghanistan? We know about it because we know it's got a tribal history. We know about it because of Alexander the Great, Roman Empire, Persians, things like that. Stuff that we're generally interested in the West. But the history of Afghanistan is that's majorly focused on the West, of our involvement in Afghanistan, the CIA involvement with Al Qaeda to fight against the Northern Alliance and Russia. in the 80s as part of a Cold War battle. So,
Yeah.
but we know about that because it's a Western thing.
Mhm.
In Britain, we know some things about that because it's our expansion and securing the edges of the borders through when we had India as part of the empire, our
Yeah,
imperial
British India.
through the 18 into the early 1900s. So we know about it for another Western reason. We know
But that's
about
the
it in
thing,
European
Aidan.
politics
It's
with China
all
going in because
Western.
of what they're doing.
You know, they're
Yeah.
all Western centric reasons. That's the key. Is all West. And my God, Mexico. We know Mexico because we took Mexico's territory in Texas, whereas now Texas used to belong to Mexico.
Yeah,
but yet Mexico is more than just the Spanish version of Mexico. Mexico was the Aztec and Mayan empires.
Yeah, and Olmecs, and you go all the way back for those groups that were in that Central American area going up and down. It's one of the few bits of history like that I learned. My first year at university, we did it's state formation in Peru. Peru is very interesting for this because it's early state formation, the valleys and how high the mountains are. And Chile as well, because it goes down the coast. So you get these coastal valleys that come in. So you've got Peru and Chile, and how they're formed as well. I only know about South American sort of 1800s history. Like you've got the Welsh colony, and everyone knows about that because it's the Welsh colony, and there we get the mix of Welsh and Spanish, which is absolutely weird to hear. But that's part of the colonial era. I know about the later stuff through the revolutions, Garibaldi, for example, and a lot of that. And it's what people forget is the U.S. cowboy was actually a South American thing. It's the gauchos coming up through the Spanish American territories because Brazil is where the beef comes from. It is why Texas, being similar to the areas of Brazil where they do this, is why Texas has a big thing about beef because they were all part of the same sort of group of places that were controlled by very similar people, and that either influenced by or owned by this large Mexican empire that was through the area. But again, we know about that because we went in there as our West, as we're calling it, went in there and did that. We know about, this is something we interacted with. We've learned about it from that perspective. And there is a lot more movement, I said, about in historiography, moving on, trying to learn about cultures from their perspective as well. And a lot of that ends up getting tied up in politics with people talking about being woke and identifying, this person has a voice for this. And it ends up getting drowned out in the political side of things of, no, like that African history it was oral history for so long. We know so little about it that you need, because it's oral history, it needs to be told by people from Africa telling us about it, to be written down by them because it's their history. Us going there and going, oh yeah, it's this and this. We've got our Western biases, and you're always going to have that mindset in your head of, we know about this place because we colonized it. So we're always going to look at it through that lens. Whereas obviously they will look at that as a part of their history, a later part of their history. Like British history has that, the part where the Normans turned up. So we then look at that as a different part of our history. Whereas obviously if the Norman Empire had survived, the Norman history would be, we'd be a colonial part of the Norman Empire. So because we were, it's like Normans, they were in France. We were a colony of the Norman Empire. But because of the way countries were then, people don't think about it like that as well. And like Rome was around so long that you ended up with all of the territories that they claimed became part of it. Like Spain's part of the Roman Empire, and this is one of the other weird things when you learn about the Roman Empire. How much do you learn about Spain when you learn about the Roman Empire? You don't.
I mean, in the United States, honestly, Spain was actually one of the empires we tend to learn more about in the United States, believe it or not.
Yeah, because it's had a greater impact.
Yeah, because Spain gave birth to Latin America. But I'm gonna throw a little bit of a tangent in there. The next episode we do, whenever that might be, because I think next week you got your
Yep. Which we'll talk about at the end of this. We might have a special.
But the next show I want to do is why I want to talk about Latin America. Why has Latin America been considered such a failure? Why has Latin America failed so much? Now, I don't want to answer that right now, but that's the reason we learn about Spain so much, because Spain is considered a big reason why Latin America has failed so miserably. And when I talk about Latin America, I'm talking about Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, the Caribbean, the Mexico, the Central America, South America. None of the countries that are in Latin America are failing. The only one that I know is doing good is my mother's country, which is El Salvador. But that's because they got a good president there that's kind of taking control of things.
And and El Salvador for a long time had a lot of issues as well.
Yeah, yep. But pretty much mostly every other a Latin American nation is struggling. Even Argentina, is having a bit of a tough time with a bit of a recession going on.
We know about it over here because every time they have a recession, they threaten to invade the Falklands, and it becomes big news because they have actually done it to cover up the failures in their country as well. Though, obviously, that comes from a British person talking about it. I mean, it's
I didn't know about that.
That's been in the UN multiple times. They bring it up every single time that they have issues, and the UN turns around and goes, "Stop trying to invade the country. It's not yours. It was a rock that a bunch of British people settled on because there was no one there. You do not own it just because it's close to you," is the standard thing. But you still have in there, they call the Falklands to Malvinas as well, and they refuse to call them the Falklands. And they keep saying, "Oh no, they're ours. They want to be ours." They keep having votes on it, and they're like, "No, we don't. We don't want to. No, go away. Stop trying to do this." But that's a modern. It's one of those weird modern wars actually that wasn't part of the Cold War. That we have, but then that's then a Western country perspective of our interactions with Argentina. We don't really have a problem with Argentina. We end up having a lot of problems with the Argentine government, and then we close ranks, and then get all very jingoistic about it. Like, yeah, remember 1982 and what we did to you then? It then becomes that very sort of patriotic style of history that you get into that, rather than looking at it objectively and going, well, no, let's have a look at this and go, like, who, if it's going to be someone, who's going to be there first, and who were the first people there? Turns out that they weren't. It was actually part of the Spanish Empire for like 6 months or something. There was a French colony, there was a Spanish colony, and then it was empty, and then we rocked up and then went, "Oh, this is much like home. It's wet and windy, and you can put lots of sheep in it." So we kind of worked there because we're a weird, wet and windy country that has lots of sheep as well. But hence New Zealand working for us as well. Wet and windy, and you can put lots of sheep in it. But you get that. So I know about the Maori Wars. I know the Maori Wars happened. I know they happened in the 1800s. It was the 1870s. I think. Look, I'm not even sure about the dates on this. I don't know much about the Maoris beyond the haka and the facial tattoos that are part of the culture. It's that cultural learning as well. But you can't learn about history until you learn about the culture and accept the culture as a thing. Then you learn about the history because you need that knowledge of the culture and how people think about things to learn about the history. And that also highlights the biases as well. So if I talk about the Falklands, obviously, I'm going to have a completely different view to a person in the US talking about the Falklands, or to especially an Argentinian talking about the Falklands, or even go somewhere near Argentina. You've got Peru, you've got all of the little ones above Argentina before you hit Brazil. You've got the kept changing. You've got all of those. There was a war going on there as well that led to the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands as well. So you get a lot of this. Obviously, this is stuff that we will end up talking about next episode. But all of that's all based on colonial things. Like, all of these people were essentially the colonists that still control it. Obviously, South America has a lot of intermixing between the people. It's actually one of the few places where the people that colonized integrated with the locals that were there on a larger scale as well. It's that interesting. It's why if you take someone from Latin America, the traditional Latin American country, Mexican, you put them next to a Spanish person, it's very, very, very different person. Obviously, there's a lot of connection there, but culturally, there are things that came through, especially even from the Aztecs, the Olmecs, the Mayans, that came
Yeah.
through into the ethos because of the intermixing. A lot of that we could go into a whole thing about disease and how that worked in that time, but that's one of the reasons why that happened. And I do wonder as well, because one of the big barriers, it's why Rome didn't go past the Sahara apart from a few sort of trips to trade, especially on the Ivory Coast area as well. And then obviously you get on the eastern coast, well, it's Somalia, that area now down almost to Kenya, but a bit north of Kenya, that area. It's very linked to the Middle East and the slave trades that went on in those areas. But then that's considered part of a separate part of history for us. So when we're looking at that, if you've got to cut something out, we tend to cut those bits out, which has then influenced how we look at the slave trade as well, because people don't learn about the initial slave trade. And Europeans were late into the game. They came along, saw this trade and went, well, we can capitalize on this. We've got all the ships, we've got the technology, we've got places where we need these people. We can jump on this and do that. And then we changed how we did it. So you get a separate type of slavery. But the industry was always there. It never stopped. That slave industry that was tapped into was the same slave industry that the Romans tapped into through Egypt. It's exactly the same industry. And even the Greeks did it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those interesting points of, if you get to this same area and learn about the history, but through various different ways.
Yeah, very different. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, this is the thing. So we're saying that we learn about that when we do learn, we learn through our interactions with them, our ethos. This is our history in Britain. We don't really learn about the British history of the Indian Empire. We don't have time to learn about it. It's like the Napoleonic Wars. When I was at school, we learned the Napoleonic Wars was literally one sentence the teacher said, and then looked at me because she knew that I knew a load about the Napoleonic Wars. And if I hadn't been in that class, I don't think she'd have even said that sentence. The Napoleonic Wars was a huge European shaping event that changed so many things. Literally, the metric system comes out of that. The reason why Brexit was so difficult is because of the Napoleonic Wars. How Russia is connected into Europe. Again, the same thing. The connections between France and Poland and what led to that alliance that started the Second World War in 1939, of why we were allied with Poland, that all comes from that as well. And like the Swedish Empire, they actually controlled far more of Europe than anyone ever realizes, because a lot of it was east into the Baltic states as well. We don't learn about the Baltic states. We barely learn about Russia as it is. So you get this. It's with this, like, to me, podcasts are one of the best ways to learn about it, because they're often done by someone who's like stuff like this. We're interested in history. We do this. Yes, I have a formal education in history. You do not have a formal education in history.
No.
You know about history. You're excited by it. You read about these things. We can have these discussions. There are topics I know more about than you do, by the dint of having a formal education. Yet we can hold a conversation about them, talk about these things as well, and a different perspectives. Obviously, your perspective on history from where you're from, and where, from my perspective, from where I'm from, are different, and they meld together. And that's what, to me, is the important part. That now we're seeing a lot of this. There's the Eastern Border podcast. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a guy who lives in, I'm going to get this wrong, Latvia or Lithuania, I can't remember which one. And he's had a few issues, obviously, with the Ukraine war, that it's changed. But he's called the Eastern Border because it's that area of the East that is still heavily connected to the West, but we don't really know much about. And he talks a lot about those types of things as well. However, then you get the translation issue. If you're doing a Chinese podcast about history, that'd be brilliant. It's going to be done in Chinese, and you're not going to get it on a Western network. And you put a Western network, it's going to be done in English. Like, no matter what country from, it's going to be done in English.
And it's funny. And it's funny, Aidan, because when you mentioned that, another thing popped into my head. Whenever you get shows like from Japan, like, you know, if you know anime and all that, and it got mixed to the Westernized world. What the Americans love to do with Japanese shows and all that, they might to whitewash it. And sometimes I get, you know, when I see something in the native Japanese language, I'm like, this isn't the same thing I saw in America. It's because they whitewashed it. They Westernized it for a Western audience.
It's the
And it's like,
subtitles ones where you see in the memes where they put the same clip with the
yep.
subtitles up from where it was released, and they're all completely different, and it completely changes the ethos behind it. And I think this goes back to that individualism, collectivism, and that whole cultural societal influence of what you perceive as well. The In the West we go to, it's one of the interesting parts about Jewish history as well. It's one of the reasons they've seen as outsiders is through a lot of history, people didn't live to great ages, but Jewish people often lived to a lot older. They used to take care of Jewish people, but culturally, and this is where all of this stuff from the Black Death being blamed on the Jews comes from. A lot less Jews got the Black Death, so they thought, oh yeah, what they've done is they've like poisoned the wells and everything. Let's go kill the Jews because, well, it's the hyper Catholic things. That's a topic obviously people know bits and bobs about in general. But one of the reasons for that was culturally was the washing of the hands around food and the religious rules around food that meant that essentially, while they didn't know about germ theory, they were doing all the things that you would do to prevent this spread of germs. And then looking after the elderly and meant that obviously you got a bit better knowledge of how to deal with someone who's got disease, even if you don't understand what the disease is, even if you can't treat it, you can do the palliative care side of it as well, which means that you have this different cultural aspect. And the Jewish culture that's gone through Europe is actually one of those interesting ones that people can look at as well, especially in the US, because the US obviously has got still got strong elements of Jewish culture in several places. It used to be Lewisham and around that area in London that you've got these strong Jewish communities as well. And the way that they do things, bits of their culture that have influenced how they do things, but it also influences how they see the world, how when they're writing about something, what they see is, well, this looks a bit weird and bad, of, well, looking after people. People did look after people in the medieval period, but not to the extent, because the Jews of the time, that was a big thing to be a good Jew at the time. You had to do these things to be a good Jew. So they had to do them as part of their community. Whereas in the wider community, it didn't really have that as much. So it's seen as separate, so it's the when you see that separation between the two, you end up with this situation where we see it through a different lens, and we think that's weird because it's a different culture. And then this is where you get your subtitle thing of, we'll do it so that the audience can understand what this is. And then the idea of it becomes about this cultural thing and how we understand it. Because if we put it in the original one, no one would watch it because they'd be like, this is weird. That's a messed up way of thinking. But it isn't a messed up way of thinking. It's a different way of thinking. It's just that's not what we've grown up with and been taught about.
Exactly.
Right. That we've been taught about is based on these are good people because they did this thing that we think culturally is a good thing. Which is now, when you look back at history, the amount of people you look at. There's a podcast called Behind the Bastards, which takes people that are famous and looks into how horrendous they were, horrendous things that they did. It's sort of about not putting people on a pedestal and going. And Churchill is the best example that I can give of that for the UK. Of we needed him as the Prime Minister during that time. He got voted out straight after World War II. He got in, and then we went, no, out, gone. He tried to get in again. He lasted like months, and he basically got chucked out of politics for being a horrendous human being. But we needed him at that time, knowing that he was a horrible person. But this is why he was the leader. That's part of learning about history of why this thing happened, and acknowledging that it's one of my favourite quotes. The past being a different time, they did things differently there because it's like a different country, because they did that, and we spend so much time trying to make the past like our current values that we can't even touch other cultures because we don't even understand what values they started off with, let alone taking apart how their modern cultural values have changed, where there's historical values in that, and then moved it all forward. It's just a mess, which is why it's then taught at higher levels, because there's so much to unpick. You can't do that in an hour lesson to 13-year-olds who are throwing rubbers at each other, like erasers for the American audience. Surprised Dungeon Dan hasn't chimed in there. But yeah, it's that really interesting our cultures are still quite far apart, and I do reckon a big part of it is because the Cold War only ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So it's only really since 1990. That's living memory. I remember 1990. I remember what I was doing like that. I mean, I was 5, so it's earlier memories, but I remember where I was. I remember what I was doing. I've got memories of that. And then the 5 years afterwards wasn't really much different as well. And it's only 5 years afterwards, I was in year 5. Like that's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I was in Norfolk. Obviously, that story at the beginning. That's from 1995. That's such a big thing. We just haven't had the time to integrate it all. And I think that people are starting to do that. And it's one of the things, obviously, we've talked about doing here on this podcast is looking at bits of history that are different, where we focus so much on Western history, having a look at some of these bits of history, because it's there. We can look at it. We can do the research on it, and we can talk about it.
And that's the thing.
There's no barrier to us now.
Today's world allows us to do that. We have the internet. It's a very powerful tool if you use it the right way. And it's really, I've been having a lot of fun researching different cultures and all that, realizing it. Aidan, listen, we've already exceeded the hour, man. Believe it or not. Yeah, man. We've had very fun topic. So Aidan, I'm gonna open the room for you to talk about what you're gonna be doing next week.
So next week I do something called airsofting, and airsofting is, for those who don't know about it, think paintball. Most people know about paintball, or think of live action Call of Duty, which you can actually do in the UK. We are doing it on World War II. It's an event. It's kind of like a LARP, but using airsoft guns. So they are realistic guns. They're called realistic imitation firearms. They look exactly the same as the real thing, but they shoot little plastic pellets, which do hurt, but don't kill people. We will be wearing the clothing of the era. The Allies will be in the Allied uniforms, the Germans in various German uniforms. And I personally will be leading the French resistance for the event. And there is a narrative behind it for the gaming event. What we're hoping is that if I can get signal, it might be a bit patchy, but if I can get on alive here to do this next week, we can talk about some of the things from the event, because certain parts of it are like reenactment, and especially with what we were talking about with how different cultures and different people are viewed through history. Speaking to some of the Germans and why they chose to wear German uniforms.
Right.
I know we have a guy who's coming along who is his family's Austrian, and he's British. I can't remember how far back that they moved, but in World War II they were in Austria as well, and he wears German uniforms, and people have questioned him about it as well, which is it's quite an interesting topic what he's talked about. So it'd be looking at bringing history alive, so that's the reenactment side of it, the airsoft side of it, so how we can do that through playing games and things like that, and hopefully we can do that. If we can't, then hopefully Lee will be able to get on, because Lee knows about airsoft and he'll be able to talk about, and he's also done reenactment, if I remember rightly, that he used to be part of a reenactment group. So that will be the topic for next week. Hopefully I can get on and talk to you live from the event with not too many explosions in the background.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. So we'll see what happens next week. So if we can get that on, that'd be wonderful. Just let me know when. Just let me know when, so I know what's going on.
Yeah. Cool.
But in 2 weeks, the next actual episode where we just sit down and talk. In 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about, as I said, why is Latin America a failure? Why is Latin America considered a failure? Why has it fallen so far behind the rest of the world? Which is I got some very interesting theories about that. So
it's a topic I'm going to have to read up on as well.
Yep. And don't forget, when we talk about Latin America, we're talking about South America, Central America, the Caribbean. So it's gonna be a whole lot of reasons. But the one hint I can give you, it all goes back to Spain.
It's Spain. I've got a lot to answer
Yep.
for this Spanish.
All right. So anyway, guys, thank you for watching. And if you didn't get to watch, the replay will be up as soon as we get out of here. So for Centurion Anchus Maximus, that's me. For the Gate, Aidan Colyer. This has been the Age of Warfare podcast. We'll see you next week potentially, but if not, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Take care, guys.
Take care.